So good evening, and it's a pleasure to be taking part in the Haslemere Festival this year. Amidst all the varied events that are going on, thank you for making the time to think about our neighbours around the world. When Jesus was asked, "Who is my neighbour?" he told the story of the Good Samaritan. It's a story that everyone knows. There are so many different points that could be made in that story, but one of the points that strikes me is that your neighbour is not always who you expect it to be. In fact, it's often the last person you expect it to be. So tonight, while the rest of Haslemere is listening to the talented Tippett Quartet, here you are, wanting to know about the impact and possibilities of this year, especially on the lives of people in poverty around the world. So thank you for being their neighbour. CAFOD supports hundreds of local organisations, many of them church-based, but not all, who work with thousands of people and communities around the world to build a better world, providing the basics, increasing access to water, helping them grow crops better, helping people develop businesses and improving their livelihoods, all to protect the earth and their communities. So whether that's in the face of conflict, big businesses, or COVID, we stand together. And tonight I'm here to look ahead to some of the opportunities from this year. As we gradually emerge from our COVID restrictions, we know that not everyone is in the same boat. As we've seen in India recently, it doesn't take much for an outbreak to soon overwhelm health systems, even more so if they're weak to begin with. And our fears for many countries across Africa last year were not realised. The deaths did not materialise, but the economic impacts have been severe. Many countries imposed severe lockdowns, which hit communities hard as they lacked the social safety nets that we take for granted. Work often became more difficult and food prices soared, even if the COVID deaths themselves did not materialise. We know that the World Bank has estimated that up to 150 million additional people will be pushed into extreme poverty by the end of the year due to the pandemic. But furthermore, we are expecting more surges in the coming year and know that, like in India, our partners, very often the local church, but not always, will be ready to offer support, and we will be ready to support them. The pandemic, of course, hasn't gone away, and the world's leaders are still talking about COVID. It dominates our political and economic space. So how do we do what our Prime Minister has described as building back better? I want to reflect a bit about the important opportunities there are this year as that we have in order to do that. Coming soon, next month, indeed, to Cornwall is the G7 meeting. The UK is hosting the meeting of world leaders. And of course, in November, later this year, the UK will co-host the climate negotiations called COP26 in Glasgow. And also this year, we've got the UN Conference on Biodiversity in China as well. But with the UK hosting the G7 and the COP26, the eyes of the world is very much on us to lead the way. And I believe that we have a duty to ensure that our voices as ordinary people are heard, to urge and encourage our government to take the kind of action that's needed to ensure a transformative recovery from this pandemic. So what have we learned so far? Let's reflect a bit on what the last year has taught us. Well, obviously, a global pandemic shows the need to work together, that cooperation is the best way, that our interdependence is a strength and not a weakness. And although we're seeing a lot of cooperation around science, there's still a lot of work to do to get that cooperation around the political table. We've also experienced and learned this year, whether here at home or around the world, that it is the people who are poor and marginalised who pay the biggest price in terms of crisis, whether it's lack of access to vaccines or being on low income, or perhaps in being precarious employment. And obviously here in the UK, there's been quite a considerable consideration of people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities being hardest hit by the deaths from the virus. Around the world, many of the global Caritas family, which is part of what CAFOD belongs to, it's the Catholic community's response around the world, those agencies have been involved in delivering basic support and other social protection programs to many communities around the world. We've seen the injustices and inequalities that were already in our world massively highlighted and exacerbated by a crisis such as COVID. And I think that's well illustrated by the inequalities of vaccine access. The other thing that struck me is that faith communities are on the front line offering practical support right across countries, whether it's here in the UK or globally. Food banks, outreach to lonely people, volunteers getting essential services such as food and medication for neighbours, or agencies that we support providing food like Caritas Jerusalem delivering food parcels, or Brazil, or in Sierra Leone providing real social protection, PPE and healthcare support to our partners. All of that, whether it's food, support or social protection, we've been neighbours to one another. And it's that concept of neighbourhood that is really critical going forward. Of course, there's always an opportunity for a crisis. COVID has shown us that we can do things differently, that we can think differently, whether it's our own neighbourliness or whether it's about the kind of social protections put in place, like the furlough scheme, or maybe it's about shared access to vaccines. What are the ways in which we can translate this good neighbourliness into the policies and systems in our society? Pope Francis thinks that thinks we can. In Fratelli Tutti, he says, we have the space we need for co-responsibility in creating and putting into place new processes and changes. So let's take an active part, he says, in renewing and supporting our troubled societies. So what are the things that we're focusing on as CAFOD in this year of 2021? It is a real opportunity, and we're campaigning to ensure that 2021 is a year of transformation. This global health crisis has had disastrous economic consequences and has already led to rapid increases in global poverty, hunger and inequality. And as I've spoken already, more is potentially to come. It's so critical that our recovery from the pandemic isn't just a return to normal, but a real reset. And that's our message to governments of the G7 and to our own government for COP26. Things can be different. We know that the decisions taken this year, whether at the G7 or beyond, will have a long-lasting impact. And we're working not just on our own, but with others within the sector and from other faiths, as well as across the wider NGO world, to work to push for outcomes that will have a positive impact on climate action and economic reform, particularly over the next 5 years. So 2 things I want to stress tonight around economic reform and climate action. So firstly on economic reform, and I'm going to focus a bit on debt because it's so important for our G7. Economic reform is one of the questions for the G7 leaders as they consider the kind of world and agreements that we have for the future. This is what building back better might mean from the pandemic. And we believe one key way to build back better is to make some key changes, particularly around cancelling debt. With others, we've been campaigning for the cancellation of debts for low and middle income countries who need it. Cancelling debts is the quickest way for countries to be able to generate more much needed resources to respond and recover from the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, 64 lower income countries were already spending more on external debts than they were on their own health systems. For instance, Zambia. It currently spends 4 times more on debt repayments than on its healthcare. And its external debt costs about $950 per person. And, you know, aside from the moral outrage of repaying debts rather than caring for their people, having money diverted from their health system is not going to help matters, especially it's not going to help the world tackle COVID. Now, the UK has taken some important steps towards debt relief with the G20, which is a broader group of world leaders. And there was a G20 agreement called the Debt Service Suspension Initiative. And that meant that the debts that were owed to the G20 nations by those 73 of the poorest countries have been temporarily suspended. And this measure was introduced by the G20 in April last year, and it's been extended now till the end of this year. Now, debt suspension is really welcome. It's great. It's a great start, but it doesn't go far enough. It's really just pushing the problem of debt back to next year, where we would say, why not get rid of it? You're already coping without those payments. Why not get rid of it? But also, the initiative only covers debts to governments. It doesn't cover debts owed to private creditors like HSBC, for instance, or BlackRock, UBS. Many African governments, such as Zambia, owe more than a third of their debts to private creditors, not to governments. So ironically, that government debt relief, the suspension of debt relief, serves just to subsidize the payments to private creditors. So it feels like here's our taxpayers' money helping to relieve the debt, but actually agencies like banks like HSBC and UBS, BlackRock are actually still getting the payments back. So we're currently campaigning for those private creditors to be part of those global debt relief efforts. And thousands of our CAFOD supporters are writing to the chief execs of big banks and investment firms to call on them to act. You know, there's huge profits still being made on the backs of the poor in the face of a COVID pandemic. So let's put it in context. G7 countries have spent around $6 trillion to fund the sort of schemes to support jobs and our economic sectors. And that's great. But the debt suspension initiative is worth about 18 billion. So 6 trillion, which is 9 zeros, 18 and 12 zeros, and 18 billion worth, which is 9 zeros. So 18 billion. But HSBC, which continues to collect debt payments from countries across the global south, has made 11 billion in profit during this pandemic. So the numbers are really quite shocking. And we know that the support for this initiative, the Debt Services Initiative, was encouraged by many thousands of supporters. So we know we can continue to keep pushing on that. For those that say, well, can we really afford it? That $6 trillion that we've spent on ourselves kind of puts it all into context. So the other issue that I wanted to flag tonight was climate action, particularly thinking about the climate negotiations, or COP26, that's at the end of the year. Climate action means, yes, reducing emissions, but it also means making adaptations around the world and also compensating countries for the loss and damage that they experience from climate impacts. And this means, as it always means, a proper financial package, as well as action at all sorts of levels, locally, as well as nationally, as well as globally. The UN calls for a $100 billion climate fund, and there's still a shortfall to that. And this year's climate negotiations are really critical. It's 6 years after the Paris Agreement, and we have to get back on track to reduce our emissions in order to keep us within 1.5 degrees of warming. Current commitments, because that's where we're at, governments are identifying what their commitments are in order to reach the Paris targets, actually show that we are way off. 3 to 4 degrees warming is actually the reality that we could be facing. So more action is needed. Now, our government has put targets in place, really great, really good commitments that have been made, but we're not seeing the real action and policy change to make it happen. We can set all sorts of targets, but what really matters is how we get there. So we're continuing to put pressure on our government to do what it can and to do more, but also to encourage other world leaders to show the ambition that we need to keep the temperature rises below that disastrous 1.5 degree threshold. We know that all countries must play their part, but the wealthy nations, who bear in many respects the greatest historic responsibility for the crisis, need to step up. And we've seen some real shifts, certainly in the last week, from the US being more involved in these negotiations. And we've been urging the Prime Minister and the ministerial team to make sure that the voices and the realities of those who are hardest hit by the climate emergencies are really listened to in the negotiations. And I know that that was a key point that Cardinal Turkson made to the Minister Alok Sharma when he visited the Vatican the other week. Now, crucial to this, to the emissions reductions, is a move away from fossil fuels. And this is something that CAFOD has been campaigning on for many years, particularly around the way in which our international aid budget is used to spend on fossil fuels to be able to support fossil fuel projects. There's been billions spent through our overseas aid budget on fossil fuel projects in the last decade, but last December, the government did commit to ceasing to support fossil fuels through its international aid budget, and that was brought into force in March. So again, a commitment made, but we need to see it in practice. And a really positive move last week from the G7 finance ministers shows that that push and that move is being made much more wider, and there is much stronger global cooperation on moving away from fossil fuels, because it will be hard. And that's why we need to have the measures in place. And that's why we're talking about a just transition. And people will say, well, you are forcing poor countries not to go down, not to use coal. That's why we are wanting a transition to enable poor countries to leapfrog, if you like, to go straight into renewable energy sources. They don't have to follow the same dirty development trajectory that we followed. They can go straight to better renewable and sustainable sources. And as we've learned through COVID, if you have targeted subsidies, then you can have a program of transition that can work. And CAFOD's working with lots of other organizations and civil society through the Climate Coalition to promote something called the Glasgow Action Plan, which lays out some very clear goals for these COP negotiations. I said before that COVID has taught us about interdependency. This is so true for climate change. But unlike COVID, because we haven't felt the impacts of climate change, I don't think we really fully understand the way in which our climate is changing. And as wealthy nations, we bear the greatest responsibility for the crisis because of our development trajectory and our development history. And so we need to step up, because it's those that are hardest hit by the climate crisis who are paying the biggest price. And it's them whose voices who are not heard. And we believe that the voices of the world's poorest communities must be heard in the recovery plans. As a Catholic organisation, I suppose I've talked quite a bit about the Pope and Jesus, but I want to say a couple of words about Pope Francis. Pope Francis has been incredibly powerful and influential, particularly around climate change, climate negotiations. I remember in 2015 how the impact of his document Laudato Si really influenced the narrative of world leaders in Paris. And now I think it's as vital as ever. He asks us to dare to dream, to reject despair, and to come together to build something new. He does recognize the dark clouds that surround us, but he asks us to look forwards and outwards. At the beginning, when I talked about us being good neighbours or good Samaritans to one another, I think that is a very strong inspiration for Pope Francis. He's posed challenges to our politicians to be good neighbours, to change the way in which we organise society, our economics, our politics and culture, to embed neighbourliness into our systems, to build concern for the dignity of people and creation instead of just about profit and economic growth that pushes the poorest and most vulnerable aside. Pope Francis is not anti-growth or prosperity, but he is anti a model that damages the earth and creates victims. And the church isn't just doing this from its teaching, but it speaks about this from its real life experience of standing firm alongside and supporting people and communities who every day face the impacts of COVID, of climate change, loss of biodiversity, of exploitation and debt, the work that CAFOD tries to do. So, is this just a pipe dream? Well, it could be easy to think that, but I do believe that many people have been fundamentally changed by the experience of COVID over the last year. And I think many people want something different for the future. And the starting point of this is what Pope Francis calls a culture of encounter, being open to others, being that neighbor, being like the Good Samaritan, stopping to help and not just walking on by. And whilst everyone brings something to the table, a culture of encounter says, well, let's listen most to those who you don't normally hear, those whose voices are often muffled or silenced. And I was at a meeting just last week, actually, with a minister who's part of the climate negotiation teams, and she was reflecting on a recent trip she made to Costa Rica as part of the COP preparations. And she was telling us about an instance where she met a family in a community, and she was genuinely moved by hearing people in that country talk about the changes in the climate and how that has been impacted in their daily lives and the challenges that they faced. And she was like, wow, you know, for us, it was our day job. We're sitting here going, yes, Minister, that's what we do. But for her, it was a real revelation to hear how people were affected by climate change and the massive difference that often quite small adaptations make that climate finance could be spent on. And it reminded me that it's those simple encounters with people that can have such a massive impact. And it is easy to be disheartened. Sometimes we feel very small, insignificant, and that our voices don't matter. But actually, that's how many people who are poor and marginalized both here and around the world feel every day. So standing alongside them and speaking with them is an important act of solidarity. Like the Black Lives Matter movement last year created a recognition, what we as Catholics would call a preferential option for the poor, a recognition that structural inequalities exist. And we simply didn't recognize the extent of our privilege, even if we don't always feel particularly privileged. Those kind of moments just tell us that the world can be different because we can see things differently. Pope Francis asks us to dare to dream. And I love the fact that he asks us to do that, not make plans, not be tactical, not find some quick wins, but to dream. With the echoes of Martin Luther King, it is a call to imagine that our world not only can, but will be different. And inspired by that vision, we can ask for it. So there are lots of ideas and action that CAFOD offers support for, whether it's signing petitions to the PM or being involved in our ongoing campaigns. Ahead of June's G7, just on the 10th of June, CAFOD will be hosting a live interfaith event streamed from Truro Cathedral, so you can sign up for that. We have a youth delegation heading to Cornwall to join in protests too. Find out more on our website. And this summer, we're inviting all our supporters to organise an online public meeting with their MPs, ideally a parish, but it could be a group of churches. It's an opportunity for us to discuss how to rebuild from the pandemic in a way that makes the world fairer. It's about making sure our voices are heard. And for the climate negotiations, we continue to work with others here in the UK through the Climate Coalition, more than 100 organisations coming together to bring our voices here. And of course, at the global level, CAFOD's working very strongly with the Vatican and other agencies to try and influence governments around the world. I said before, in 2015, I was in Paris when for the climate negotiations. And Pope Francis had issued Laudato Si that summer, and it was such a game changer. And I remember hearing not just the influence, but I heard different language, the language of a moral imperative that came from world leaders. Our world leaders now are very different, and the need for change is more desperate than ever. But I think as a church and as communities, we have documents, we have our values, we have our sense of wanting something different. We have our experience. I think the challenge is to ensure we have our voices heard. Thank you for listening tonight.
Thank you, Christine. Wonderful. Now, you might have a little job to do. So Christine's just popping away for 10 seconds or so. She'll be back straight away. Any questions, please? Could we pop them on the chat? Look, that was amazingly quick. Well done.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I have to put the oven on to feed my family.
Right, now Mike Aegis has a question. So would you like to unmute yourself, Mike? There we go.
Hello. It's a bit of a question which delves into history. Obviously, you're not necessarily a history expert, but obviously there's the present pandemic, coronavirus. But in the last 100 years, there was Spanish flu about 1918, and then more recently there was the AIDS. Now you were talking about interdependence and about lessons that we can learn about interdependence. Do you know whether there were any lessons to be learnt as regards those two previous epidemics, and whether one or two of them were actually actioned successfully and maybe one or two of them weren't actioned successfully?
Thank you, Mike. That's a really good question. I guess it depends on what level. I know that from the HIV and AIDS crisis in particular, that certainly from CAFOD's perspective, we were working as part of a very strong interfaith kind of group, and what happened was that we joined with other agencies to really kind of reflect and share on what was the role of faith communities in responding to the crisis, and both for good and for not so good in parts. And we produced a number of documents and some really strong learning for that, which we've been consistently feeding into government in terms of the role and contribution of faith-based organisations and faiths in responding to crises like this. How much we've seen that learning manifested in the current crisis has been interesting. It hasn't been particularly strong. This government's response has been primarily to fund through the multilateral agencies, which is good and positive, but actually getting resources down to the ground, as it were, to local agencies, and particularly to very kind of frontline services. It just takes an awfully lot longer through the multilateral systems. So I would hope that many of, certainly from the scientific community and also from the sort of like emergency response community, there's been quite a lot of lessons learned. But I have to say that I'm really intrigued to read through the what Dominic Cummins said to the committee today, because I don't think that showed that there was a great deal of preparation or lessons learned from the past. But I think that's another reason why, if we've got experience, we need to make sure that our politicians hear it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Now, James Rapp, you have a question.
Hello, Melanie. Thanks. Hello, Christine. Hello. Thanks very much indeed for coming, by the way, because obviously I was part of asking you to come down. Thank you. I was very interested to hear what you said about debt and that volume of debt owed, and I hadn't realised how much was owed to the private banks and banks. But I just wondered, in terms of sort of looking for it to be written off, I'm just wondering, is there an issue as to people looking at the different countries with different debts as to how they got into that position in the first place? And people, probably, some organisations probably struggling a bit to sort of take a unified view, because some have tried hard and got into debt. Others have probably spent an awful lot of money inappropriately. And I just wonder how your grouping look at that in trying to advise the way ahead, really.
Well, thanks, James. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point. There's always that argument made, isn't there, about if, I suppose it's a little bit like the sort of deserving and the undeserving, or whether or not there's kind of incentives there for people to kind of act with probity in the future. I mean, I think the reality for us is that it's not the there are, we have quite big debts ourselves. The Americans have massive debts. It's a question about how that's then impacting on the economy, and obviously there are arguments about being fair about kind of debt cancellation. Our argument is it's very much about the poorest countries of the world, and you're absolutely right that we wouldn't want to be cancelling debts that are the result of kind of like mega corruption or kind of siphoning off. And there is a track record, if you like. Debt cancellation has been something that's been around for quite some time. I think many of you might remember the Jubilee debt campaign, and that was very much around kind of like turn of the century kind of experience in the late 90s. So there's a fair amount of work being done about what would be the criteria, what would be some of the elements, the mechanisms to do it. So it's not just a kind of suddenly deciding, okay, it's all off. It's quite a level of technical sort of working through. But from our perspective, it's a matter of principle that we're coming at it from, rather than kind of like specific details. But those details are definitely in place, and people who are more capable than I am at working these things out it's really important to say, yeah, this is not as simple as it looks, but there's a making the decision about, do we support it or don't we? That should be more simple.
Now, do we have any other questions?
Looks like John Strain has got one. He's got a thumb up anyway. Or maybe just that's all.
I'm also very happy if people want to just make some comments. You don't always have to ask me questions.
Christine, you didn't mention the reduction in overseas aid by the government. I mean, it's well written about, isn't it? But I'm assuming you're seeing that is having significant impact in certain places, or will do anyway.
Well, yes. I mean, it's extremely disappointing. I mean, I think it's an act of wanton vandalism, and I think in the context of the UK wanting to, being on the global stage and wanting to play a global Britain role, I think it's very, very short-sighted, and it's evidently a political decision. And in terms of the impact, yes, we've seen it. We've seen it already. We're seeing it in this financial year, and we will see it next financial year too. So this is not a simple sort of thing. So the UN agreement, or the target that was actually legally enshrined within legislation, is of a percentage of the UK's economy, and it's when the general economy shrinks, then that percentage will shrink. So we've already seen some reductions in the aid budget anyway over the last year, because our economy has shrunk, and that's perfectly understandable, and that's fine. So therefore, this current level of cuts goes on top of an additional layer of cutbacks that we've seen. Now, the other issue for me is that this government has decided that it's going to keep its commitments to the likes of the World Bank and the IMF and the UN. So there's multilateral things which are fine up to a point, but there's particular points with the World Bank whereby they could have much more easily kind of rescheduled some of their payments to make the current cuts less. They could have cut on the repayments to the World Bank, but what instead has happened is that they've effectively ring-fenced those multilateral and the World Bank commitments, and so they've cut the bilateral aid, which is their direct government-to-government or direct country-related programs. So if you're in South Sudan, Yemen, Sierra Leone, those country programs are facing nearly 60% cuts, which is absolutely disproportionate when you think, we're not cutting anything to the World Bank. And obviously, bilateral funding is where funding from organizations like ourselves gets given to. We get a very, very tiny amount of money from the UK government. The vast majority of our funding is from the Catholic community. But I know of colleagues in other organizations who are facing really significant cuts. One particular agency has got to reduce their budget by 40%, 40%. It's absolutely shocking. And these are very often, smallish programs that, there are a few million quid here and there that make really significant differences to the lives of people, because it's targeted, because it's very much that last mile. It's very, very local organization, delivered by local organizations. It's local community support. It's not government to government, as it were. It's not, and so that it's very disappointing to see the depth of the cuts there, and also the fact that the government has, we know that ministers have found it very difficult to justify, embarrassingly difficult to justify, which makes it clear to me that it's not been well worked through, and it's been extremely difficult for civil servants to actually deliver on, because it's all been done at very short notice, without a real kind of sense of criteria. I've heard of situations where, ambassadors have not even been told, the levels of cuts in their own countries. It's a shambles, frankly, and it's extremely disappointing. Thank you for raising it.
Thank you, Christine. I think Mike has got a second question.
Hello there again.
Right.
This is not to do with pandemics this time. This is on the subject of the climate change and fossil fuels. I wondered whether CAFOD has got a policy as regards nuclear power in this country. Obviously, CAFOD isn't sort of trying to set up nuclear power in third world countries. I guess CAFOD might be interested in setting up wind turbines and solar panels in third world countries. But as regards policy to do with nuclear power, obviously in this country we've got quite a lot of nuclear power, and even though it's not contributing to the warming of the climate, there's other factors associated. Well, one is the factor of jobs for people that are working in that particular industry. Another aspect is the possible connection between nuclear power technology and nuclear wars and things like that, and being involved with trade with other countries. So I was wondering whether CAFOD think it's okay to have nuclear power as a step in the course of trying to move from fossil fuel technology to eventually to wind turbine and solar panels, or whether CAFOD are generally against suggesting governments, including ours, put their resources into nuclear power.
That's a good question. The honest answer is I don't know. In terms of, I'm not aware of us having a specific policy around nuclear power. I think it's going to have to be a situation whereby, if you like, it's a precautionary principle, and it's what is the best option for a country. I know that we wouldn't, and it's obviously not something that we're involved in terms of delivering or supporting, whereas we are involved in supporting things like renewable energy access and stuff. So our primary kind of request would be, or primary support would be, for renewable energy, and particularly at an appropriate kind of access level. I think the issue about nuclear is I can imagine that it's a good stepping stone to ease away from fossil fuels, where you've got existing nuclear kind of mechanisms or plants. The issue for me would be, I wouldn't see it as a significant or serious contribution if you didn't have it. That's why I was talking about leapfrogging. Why not just go straight to investing in renewable energy systems, rather than rather than kind of like diverting resources, if you like. The amount of, how long it takes, the amount of money it takes, how long it takes to actually build plants and get them all set up doesn't seem to me to be a helpful kind of stepping stone on the way if you don't have it already. But I don't think that that nuclear is an answer in and of itself. It's got to be a step on the way. So it's a really good question, Mike, but I don't think we take a particular position around it from that perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now there's a point from John Strain. John, would you like to make this point yourself, or shall I read it out? I'll read it out. Two things shocked me on your remarks on debt. The first was the extent to which debt is owed to private banks who are not under the control of governments. Ought there to be more control over the private banks to enable this debt to be released?
Perhaps I could just amplify that briefly. Can I be heard? I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Can hear
Please
you,
speak.
Yes, what particularly shocked me was you mentioning the HSBC Bank. 13 years ago, many of these private banks were bailed out very, very substantially by the government because they were deemed, in the words of the Chancellor, too big to be allowed to fail. So it is quite clear that there is an essential umbilical cord actually between private banks and governments. I use the term loosely, internationally. I just wonder if we, the public, aren't doing enough to make it clear to banks via our governments that they cannot afford to be simply free agents in this respect. I wonder what you think about that.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, and that's partly why we've been campaigning, because the focus has been so much on government debt, debts owed to government, and actually, like I gave the example in my speech about, the repayments, a third of Zambia's repayments are to private creditors, not to other governments, and obviously those are kind of private arrangements, if you like, and they're debts that are kind of movable. So I do agree that's why, from our perspective, the campaigning work to be able to contact to be influencing banks is so critical. And you can find out more on the CAFOD website about our work on cancelling debt from the private creditors, and I think it is something that governments have to step in to actually say, well, this is what we want. I think the other thing that you make, the important point there, which I hadn't really clicked, was that point about the fact that yes, private banks have been bailed out by government. So when it comes down to it, it's a kind of it's being shored up from all sides. So not only is there's a
degree of leverage on them.
Yes, exactly. So I think there's definitely work to be done there. So thanks for flagging it.
And John, did you want to carry on with your point about the Catholic Church?
If I may, very, very briefly, one of the sad features of the reaction to the pandemic has been, to my mind, the lack of truly international collaboration. There has been some, and I salute it, but I was looking at some figures recently to see that showed that the number of people who have lost their lives in the United Kingdom is comparable to the number of people who died, UK civilians, during the whole of the Second World War, just over 100,000 people. And that event evoked the astonishing degree of cooperation rather than competition that the world had seen before the Second World War, seen in the great international agencies. Sadly, these it seems to be a considerable loss of faith in internationalism. Yet there's one truly international body, and that is the Catholic Church, carrying the faith in every single nation. I sometimes wonder, do you think the Church, I'm not quite sure who I mean here, Pope Francis, the cardinals, our own bishops, couldn't strive to do a little more to make us all aware of the importance of acting in solidarity and to stand against those in the United States who've been so critical of Pope Francis in many ways and have rushed to support Donald Trump. Given that the Catholic Church prides itself on its unity and Catholicity, couldn't it be a little bit more united and Catholic in the bishops expressing the importance of international collaboration? Sorry, that's a bit of a long one.
No, it's a great one, and thank you so much. I mean, actually, I'm with you totally. I mean, I suppose a couple of comments. In America, the Catholic bishops in particular are hugely divided. I mean, it's a Trump legacy, I guess, and I think that sense in which the church in Africa in America really could have stepped up better, I think is really quite a strong point, and I think that is something in terms of learning to be done. And I don't know how you kick a bishop in that respect, but anyway, I think the other side of it is from the Pope, we've got a very he's been concerned, right from day one, and he'd set up a Vatican commission looking at kind of COVID and a COVID reaction and a COVID response, and that's been really important, I think, in terms of helping to bring some of the aspects of the church together in response. It hasn't fully reported yet. I think there's an action plan that's kind of like due later on in the year, and I know Pope Francis, that's why he's called for this synod approach to start, because I think it's a really important thing for the church to be seen to be acting together at a local level. We've seen that. We've seen churches and faiths really coming together and being the neighbours and providing that kind of witness. And to be honest, I wish the churches and the faith communities could talk a bit more about that, because I think the way in which people have responded has been incredible. And I think we could actually we should blow our own trumpets a little bit to be actually saying we've been part of this and you can learn some lessons from it. But it's a good point. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Now, there's a point from Joe that says the cut to aid is meant to be temporary. How can we persuade the government to return to 0.7% of GDP?
Thanks, Joe. So I think one of the important issues here is about making sure that your local MP knows about it. One of the things that I often get in talking with MPs about things like aid and other issues that we're interested in is they always say, well, no one ever writes to me about this sort of thing. No one ever talks to me. And that's why these Parliament in your parish meetings, I think, are that we've been trying to support this year is so critical, of getting and encouraging local churches, whether as individual churches or as a group of churches, to meet with your local MP and to talk about the kind of issues that are worrying you. And we've had some really great worrying you at the kind of global level, if you like, not just kind of like street lamps or something, but we've had some really good engagement so far, because I think it's really important. We know that there is quite a strong view in Parliament that if the decision around cutting the aid budget had gone to a vote, it would have lost. So we know that there's a strong sense of parliamentary support for our aid budget that people do, politicians mostly, there are some notable exceptions, but mostly kind of do feel it's got a level of support. So I think it's just something about keeping the voice going. And I think particularly in terms of stressing that, I've actually heard, even over the last few months, quite a shift in what ministers and senior civil servants have been talking about. When I last met with Wendy Morton, who's Parliamentary Under Secretary of State, she was at pains to stress it was temporary, and it's like, we really want to get back to it as soon as possible, you know. And I think just keep making sure that your voices are heard, because I think it's pushing at an open door.
Sorry, can I just come in there?
Yep.
Yeah, I would like, thank you, Christine. Yes, I would actually like to say that Jeremy Hunt, who is the MP for South West Surrey, which covers Haslemere, has agreed to meet with a group of us. I live in Godalming, in St Edmunds Parish in Godalming, and I know that he wasn't keen on the cut to the aid budget, so I should certainly be bringing that up with him and encouraging him to make his feelings felt on that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jo. Yes, and great to be meeting with people like Jeremy Hunt, and Theresa May was one of the ones recently as well. So great. And I've just seen Mike's question on the chat. So yes, so international development is now incorporated into the Foreign Office. So it's been merged. So it's now the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO. So the Secretary of State for International Development is now the Foreign Minister, Dominic Raab, but he has a ministerial team under him. So again, I mean, there's so there's different ministers that will take on different kind of roles, but it's Wendy Morton was the minister in terms of civil society that we met with quite recently. So you can find out on parliament.uk kind of who the cabinet teams are and cabinet officers and stuff. So yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christine. I think we're going to wrap it up there now. I would like to say a big thank you, Christine, for a really very, very interesting talk. I mean, the economic reform, golly, we've heard figures that I don't think any of us even understand half the time. They've got so many noughts on the end of them. So we know that something somewhere has got to happen, really. And regarding the climate action, certainly I think most of the councils locally have all declared climate emergencies, and we're all working hard. Certainly Haslemere Town Council has, I'm sure Godalming Town Council has. So, you know, from grassroots, we're really trying to push forward and hope that, you know, we do dare to dream, really. It's a very good thing to hang on to, really, isn't it? Because if you start to look at it, it just looks impossible. But if you dream it, everything becomes possible then. So it's a wonderful analogy. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for your time. Good. How wrong I was. There you go. Good. See, Zoom is not all bad. Lovely. So,
well, can I just say a big thank you to you and all of the people who came tonight. As I said at the beginning, you know, thank you for giving up your time to listen to me, and also I know, you know, for your own engagement, whether you're a CAFOD supporter or a volunteer or other people. I think it's fantastic to have an audience like yourselves as people who are so committed and are interested in finding out about the world. So thank you so much for inspiring me as well.
Good, lovely, thank you. So ladies and gentlemen, if I could ask you now please to leave the meeting. I just need a very quick word with Christine at the end, and we'll do that when everybody's gone. But thank you very much indeed for popping in. It's great, lovely, well done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night everyone, thank you so much.